RevOpsAF, the only podcast for people who are RevOpsAF and want to learn all about things that are RevOps AF.
Our goal is to give the revenue operations community, that includes marketing, sales, and CS, for any of you not paying attention, the skills needed to accelerate their careers.
Hello, everyone. I am Matthew Volm, CEO and co-founder of RevOps Co-op and co-host of RevOpsAF, the podcast. Today, we are going to be talking about RevOps KPIs, how to drive the best business outcomes with your RevOps teams, and how to measure the performance of those teams. And we're going to be diving into that topic with Henry Mizel, who is the SVP of Revenue Operations at Apollo.io. Henry, welcome, my friend. I would love to actually have you tell us a little bit about you and your professional background and give us the lowdown on Apollo as well, because it's unique in the sense that you are leading revenue operations at a revenue technology company, one that a lot of revenue operators are very familiar with. So tell us a little bit more about yourself, your background journey into revenue operations, and then Apollo.
Yeah, certainly. Thank you for having me, Matt. I think it's funny you kind of point that out. There's a very meta element to being in RevOps at Apollo because it is a RevOps tool. And I think in my previous company, a company called Breather, we were customers for about 4.5 years. So that's how I first became aware of Apollo. You see this really phenomenal tool built for RevOps people that simplifies how companies go to market, and like they make a lot of the RevOps feature functionality in a box. So we'd seen that firsthand, and that was part of my journey in arriving at Apollo. But yeah, background, been in RevOps since probably before it was really called RevOps. I think going on like 12, 13 years now. Sales before that, been at a few startups, like I mentioned, Breather being one of them, and then Apollo for the last 4 or so years.
Yeah. That's great. So I was looking at your LinkedIn profile beforehand, and I think, well, one, it may be obvious to people listening or watching that you are from the UK, but I have a question. Did you actually start your career as a foreign exchange trader on the London Stock Exchange? Is that right?
Not on the stock exchange, but it was a very small boutique brokerage, very old school, very phones based, but they had a homegrown CRM. And I early on got into that CRM and started plugging some RevTech tools into it. That was kind of the first real foray into evolving sales into a modern.
That's awesome. I bring that up because, again, this may sound obvious, but no one goes to college or university to get a degree in revenue operations. So folks typically wind up in a RevOps role or team through all different paths, while everyone winds up in RevOps from a different career trajectory, call it, or place. I think that's actually the common thread, is just how diverse the perspective and experience that revenue operators bring to the table. I mean, I've talked to foreign exchange traders. I've met someone the other day who actually was a geologist before they got into revenue operations. So just a plethora of stuff that people did pre-RevOps, which I think is fascinating. I think actually sets you up for success in RevOps, because you have to have that natural curiosity. And like you mentioned, you kind of demonstrated this interest in CRM and the technology and the tooling that was there. And that started you down this path to now being the SVP of Revenue Operations at Apollo. You've been there now, 3.5+ years, almost 4 years. You've seen revenue operations at a variety of different companies. So before I start asking you about KPIs and the ways that you measure the effectiveness or performance of your team, tell us a little bit about how your team is structured. How many people do you have on the team? How do you focus their energy? Do you split them between maybe the stakeholders they're meant to support, sales versus marketing versus post-sales or CS? Or do you look at systems, analytics? How do you have your current team set up at Apollo?
I think my central philosophy when building a RevOps team, and this was true at Breather and before as I was starting to formalize RevOps, and definitely true at Apollo, it's having a centralized model, kind of like you call it like the separation of church and state. I think to be truly objective and a strong strategic partner for your stakeholders and for the business, you need that separation. You also need to centralize for business context alignment and making sure everyone's using the same definitions, everyone's building around the same core infrastructure, everyone is aligned around the core operating plan and priorities. Typically, I break it into 4 pillars. There's a strategy and ops pillar, and that's process, capacity planning, territory management, incentive comp. Then you've got your GTM or revenue stack, Salesforce, HubSpot, Intercom, Apollo. Then there's analytics, go-to-market analytics, revenue, data engineers, and finally the enablement pillar. If you can bring all of that together in a box, centralized, it's very well aligned and very well set up to serve the business and drive towards that common goal.
Yeah, I like that and makes sense. And I agree on having that separation and having the right things centralized. I think there's tons of value there. So with those pillars in mind and the way you have things structured at Apollo, how do you currently look at measuring the performance of your team? Are there specific metrics, KPIs? What are the things that you're looking at on a daily basis or a weekly or monthly basis to tell you, hey, this pillar is performing as I expected, or this one is not, or this team or this person is not doing the thing that I thought that they should be doing or that they are doing or performing at the level that I need them to?
Yeah. To that point, there's a level component to this. So given the time of year we're at, planning season, I think you start with the annual plan. Like, what is it the company is prioritizing this year? What is it we want to achieve? And that's obviously revenue based or like initiative and project based. As for aligning the team, it is down to an alignment thing. I'll measure my team, like the direct RevOps team, on the success of the core business partner they support or they're aligned to. So, for example, for the sales ops team to really perform well, the expectation would be sales has hit their number. They've done so at a target level of efficiency. There's the project side of it as well. There may be some deployments we're looking to build or some optimizations or some workflows. That is ultimately in service of a more efficient, more revenue generating, higher production sales force. But to be ultra successful, the expectation would be that sales has hit their number.
Yeah.
Same for marketing, right? Like it's a different vector, but marketing, demand gen, have they generated the pipeline they were expected to do at the target ROAS that we set?
Yeah. So on the topic of alignment, because I think that's the critical piece here, and there's a lot of different things that you can align. Since we're talking around KPIs and metrics, let's talk about aligning those goals that you have, right? Those targets that your teams are trying to hit with the work and the things that your team is doing. In the past, I've used OKRs, the OKR framework, objectives and key results, as a way to plan things on a quarterly basis. And so in the past, when I've been doing business operations or revenue operations, I would always start with company level objectives, team level objectives. And ultimately you get to this point where you've got those targets. Hey, we want to generate X dollars of new business this quarter. For RevOps or BizOps, then it's, well, what can we do as a revenue operations team to support our sales stakeholders to hit that number? Maybe it's technology related. Maybe there's a new tool that you can integrate or deploy that'll save your salespeople time on admin or non-selling related activities. Or if it's an expansion revenue number that you're trying to hit, maybe it's one of those things where it's, hey, we don't have a documented process on how we identify expansion prospects, or whose job it is to identify them, how the handoff happens. So maybe you look at some process improvements. You align those activities, those things that you as an operations team have control over, to those metrics, those KPIs, those key results that you're ultimately trying to hit. To me, that's always been a great way to answer the question and make that clear link between the stuff that you're doing today and this week to those targets, those goals, those results that you're trying to hit. In your past, or whether it's at Apollo, how have you seen those things work the best to drive that alignment? Is OKRs the things that you all do? Do you have an annual plan and then you try to align those activities as well? Talk a little bit about your own process for aligning those inputs with those outputs that your team is trying to drive and support.
Yeah, it's very similar at Apollo and at Breather. We use the OKR framework. That's quarterly planning as well, but that really backs into and maps to an annual plan. That was true at Breather, it's true at Apollo. The annual plan will set the revenue goal for the year. It will set some really key themes for the year. And then as teams plan each quarter, that will be when you have bite size chunks or big rocks from an objective and key result standpoint that really maps to that plan. And 1 + 1 + 1 + 1 doesn't have to equal 4. It just has to get you directionally there. And these are the big bets that we want to make because we think that the investment in those big bets is going to yield more than any other investment in any other area. And that's the focus against driving towards that plan.
Yeah. And what's a typical cadence as folks get into this process? So they're measuring, let's say they've got some goals, some company targets. They've pulled out pieces of those, right? Of like, okay, I'm going to help drive this one. Maybe they've got some things listed, some of their inputs, some things that my team's going to do this quarter to help drive this new business number forward, or this expansion number forward, or this MQL or marketing source pipeline number forward. What should they do next? What's a cadence that you've seen work best to make sure those things stay top of mind and that you're actually executing against them? Are these things that you review on a daily basis, weekly basis, bi-weekly, monthly? How should people be looking at that?
Yeah, it's situational and it depends. The general hard rule is what we say we're going to do at the start of a quarter is what we're going to do. Barring some big fundamental unknown in the planning process, that generally should hold true. There's not really much that can't wait until the next quarter if you're talking about big initiatives. There's obviously fires that will pop up. There'll be small pivots. There'll be things that you need to do to run the business. But if you've spent time planning on a yearly or a quarterly basis, and you've put that work in to really scope, evaluate, size up the impact, then you should be able to stay the course and execute against that because you believe that that's the strategy that's going to be most successful. And that execution against the strategy is critical, that you don't get distracted or you don't lose focus. I think in terms of cadence for reporting, it probably depends more on the level, size, and scope, and just the general reach of that project. If it's a big quarter-long initiative, I think bi-weekly is fine. And I generally look at a relatively comprehensive, say, half-pager of how we're performing against that. And then the length and detail of that write-up is going to directly correlate to how well we're pacing to achieve it. If we're green, I don't need that much. It's good exposure and communication to share across the business. But as you move into yellow, or if you're in red for something, then it's much more like, why are we there? What are we doing about it? How do we improve? How do we get back on track? And then maybe you accelerate the reporting cadence of that readout to get you back there as quickly as possible. But then additionally, if there's components of those big rocks and big initiatives, or if there's something that's like really net new, or maybe like slightly higher risk, bigger bet, then initially as you launch that, then maybe daily or maybe every other day as a stand-up. And there's a few initiatives that we've done where we've like, well, we believe this is going to be really impactful, positively or negatively. And that's when you do a morning stand-up to make sure we're monitoring the metrics that matter. If they then dip, we can be really, really quick to react and mitigate any harm. Fortunately, that doesn't happen too much.
Yeah, that makes sense. A couple of main things to consider on the timing aspect is, one, you mentioned as you develop maybe some of these goals or KPIs, think about the time horizon. You want to find the right balance of, you don't want something to be out there so far out into the future that so much can change in between. The last thing you want to do is tell yourself, I set this goal based on where the business is at or what's important right now. That's no longer really important, but I set it, and so I'm going to march towards it. I have seen that happen before. Typically, it's been at very, very large companies. So that's definitely not a spot that you want to be in. I think the quarterly balance, as you mentioned, is good if our business is in a spot where we should be able to execute on some things over 90 days. We're not going to see anything so dramatic within that time period that it would cause us to totally rethink that or revisit that. That's a good cadence. To your point on the check-ins or reporting on how you're tracking against KPIs, don't just take that for granted and say every week, every 2 weeks, but think about how often should I be making progress on this? If you should be making progress on it every day, then theoretically you should have something to report on every single day. But if maybe it's 90-day thing, or if it's a 6-month thing and it's only part of what you're doing this quarter, it might be that every single day, that's not a thing you're working on. And maybe that's every 2 weeks, right? That makes the most sense. So just be intentional about that. Don't take that for granted. And actually, I'll say that again, to keep these things top of mind as fires pop up, which you mentioned as well. So it can be easy to get in a spot where you forget, but It's more like other stuff starts to take up the front part of your memory as you go throughout the quarter. You start to be reactive, those new things pop up, those fires pop up, and because you're in go mode, you're just like, okay, new problem, how am I going to fix it? And you can lose sight of those main objectives that you have for the quarter. So the other thing I always try to tell people is be intentional about those as well. When someone comes to you with a problem they want you to solve, actually stop and ask yourself, and maybe even them, the question of what KPIs, what objectives is this going to help us achieve this quarter? And assuming you can answer that, then go forth and conquer, execute on them. But more often than not, that can actually be a good thing where it's like, oh yeah, actually, this is not related to anything we're trying to get done this quarter. So park that. Let's get to that maybe for planning for the next quarter or thereafter. So just be intentional and thoughtful about those
Yeah,
things.
and I think there's an element of the planning, the strategy piece. So you've got the two sides of the coin in strategy and execution. Was the strategy right? Was it well executed? Was strategy wrong? Was it well executed? Or was it wrong and just poorly executed as well? The combinations of that result in different outcomes. But you gotta, as a company, you have to adopt the same planning philosophy. If you plan a quarter well, you're adjusting for the run the business and keep the lights on work, and then you're adjusting for just fires, unknowns. But generally, you have a good mix of strategic focus time, and that should be consistent across all teams. And those teams should plan well pre-quarter or pre-period. And that will manifest in a decent project plan that you're tracking to. If it's daily progress, weekly progress, you're taking chunks down against that project plan. When done well, that should limit those cross-functional unexpected asks of, hey, we need you to come and do this being a kind of week-long, 2-week-long thing. That was either called out as part of detailed scoping and strategy, or it was unknown, and you need to adjust for that. It's evaluating the impact of leaving that period of time. Ideally, you mitigate that through strong cross-functional planning across the business.
So as we record this, we are approaching year-end, calendar year-end. So I don't know if you all are on a calendar or fiscal.
We're fortunately on fiscal, so we still have about 6 weeks to go.
All right. So for this question, whether you want to look at things through the current quarter or the one you wrapped up about 6 weeks ago, can you give some examples of specific metrics or KPIs that you're tracking as leader of your revenue operations team? And I don't mean how many millions of new business you wanted to close last quarter and how you actually performed against that, but new business revenue, expansion revenue. What were those things that are relevant to the stakeholders that you support? Can you give some examples of what those things are from the most recent quarter you wrapped up or the one you're currently operating in? And then some examples, one or two, of specific things, whether it's projects, initiatives, processes that you've deployed and your team has worked on to influence some of those KPIs, just so that people can get a sense of, oh yeah, here's a KPI, here's a thing that we did to align.
Yeah, I think a lot of the metrics, because it's a centralized RevOps team, we're a team of about 25, we have good coverage across most of the whole business. Our metrics are fundamentally the metrics in the operating plan, and that's just going to be like new business, upsell business, retention-based metrics. But there's a lot of inputs into that. Those inputs are either direct drivers to the model or calibration and measurement metrics. An example would be LTV to CAC for the program, for the team, for the department. Like every department's going to be different. Some are going to be higher, lower yield. But are we investing at the right level versus what we're getting out? You can underinvest in a strong channel to the point that you sacrifice growth for some level of efficiency that's unnecessarily high. That's the financial lens we look at. Are we investing the right amount in the right teams? Are we optimizing that investment for the output and growth we can get from it? I'd say specific examples of metrics that the team has owned. So going back, I think it was last quarter, we were looking to optimize our MQL and demo flow. We also had a company objective to integrate more of the product and push the Apollo product to its limits for where it was at the time, and use that to identify new use cases and new ways to implement it into your go-to-market. One of the strategies we came up with was to build a form enrich tool. directly into our demo form.
Hmm.
We stripped everything but email out, used our API to fill in all of the demographic and firmographics, and then used our routers to effectively route that MQL to the sales rep. Then we pop up a book a meeting flow directly in that form. The goal was to drive more efficiency, improve conversion rate of demos, and then the secondary goal was to improve routing and just get the kind of misfires under 3%. So that was our goal. Super successful. We saw form conversion increase 40%. I think it was like 39 actually, but really, really strong improvement to form conversion. We saw form to meeting confirmed increase to about 88%. Then you effectively generate more pipeline out of the top of funnel form fills. Routing accuracy improved well below the kind of target threshold we set. So it's kind of a win across all those different vectors. Now, it wasn't overnight. There was optimizations and tweaks we made to it along the way, but that has been a kind of really strong success, and it's something we actually have live still.
Yeah.
Day to day.
That's awesome and pretty incredible, right? Because you started with a very clear problem or metric that you were trying to drive in terms of conversion rates on a page with your forms. You identified a solution, you went and executed, iterated on that, and you saw some very clear positive performance and outcomes. There can be a number of things that you could have tackled to try to improve your conversion rate. So how did you and the team narrow in on the form specifically? It sounds like the number of properties that people were needing to fill out. How did you narrow in on that as the solution to solve?
I think we definitely tackled more than a few initiatives that we felt pretty strongly on. You come in with a thesis of, if we change this process, if we enhance this process, intuitively, does it make sense? Intuitively, if you take 6 fields out of the form, will more people complete the form? Yeah. Intuitively, if we have our routing set up and our segmentation set up, which is an internal definition that people coming to our website don't know, are we going to be more accurate if we use our data versus user input data? Yes. Often the person filling in forms will have their view of how big the company is or the segment they're in or the revenue size. That may or may not be correct. You can take more control over those core variables to your process. That's going to all compound to make it more accurate or to remove friction. I think it's hard to necessarily say, I think we're going to drive a 40%. I had a target in mind, which was quite a lot lower than that. And that's a great surprise. And that's sustaining. So the experiment we ran was very clearly stat sig on that lift. And you can have a pretty high level of confidence going in that if executed against that should drive the improvement. And then in terms of sizing the return on investment, we know roughly what level of work is involved to do it. We know what our current inbound pipeline gen from that channel is. So you can start to say, well, if the low end is X%, the high end is Y%, what's the monetary increase to down funnel closed won revenue? And that gives you, we're spending X dollars to produce 10X dollars.
Yeah, I love that. And it makes so much sense in terms of how you can measure that all the way down to what you just described of pipeline and ultimately revenue. And again, the main thing I always try to tell people is don't try to overcomplicate it. Feel like you need to get super pinpoint accurate. Like you said, high end, low end, develop a range, use averages, medians that you have. You don't need to round to the cent to understand the impact that you're able to have. Use the data that you have available, think through it logically and talk through it like we just did, and then measure those things, do the actual math, and that'll get you a pretty solid answer in terms of the impact and the success. But yeah, don't shy away from that. Actually understanding the ultimate revenue outcomes and pipeline outcomes that you described are super critical to measuring the success of that work that your team did. So I've got 2 more questions for you. One is RevOps related, one is not. My first RevOps related question is actually, we talked a little bit about this, but your own career advancement to now being a Senior Vice President of Revenue Operations at a large, well-known revenue technology company. What's been the path and any advice you might have for other revenue operators looking to grow in their career?
I think you touched on it. Most RevOps professionals, practitioners, they don't go to college, university to study it specifically. Everyone has their own different route in, different path in. I think the sales mindset works. Finance background definitely helps. Technical is, I wouldn't say a full prerequisite, but you need to have a certain degree of technical aptitude. But I think more than anything else is be really curious, just understand as best as humanly possible what goes into the business, the customer journey, understand that end to end, both from a human standpoint and a number standpoint. If you can understand the math of the funnel, then you can start to pull the levers. But also you need to understand, what does it feel like for the customer? Like, what is even the mental thought process, conscious or subconscious, of going to go-to-market platforms website that has world-class data?
Yeah.
That's the start of the customer journey and the customer experience. Removing friction, removing steps to optimize the flow. You've got to understand that side as well. And then it's not just like sales ops works in sales ops, like sales ops, understanding top of funnel marketing ops, understanding the customer journey to post-sales, CS support. What does that experience look like? How do you remove friction there? How do you make it a better overall experience? Understanding the finance side. There's a lot of things you can do, but ultimately RevOps is doing less with more and accelerating growth. So understand the math of the investment. If we're going to invest X $100,000 in whatever, people, platform, tools, what's our thesis there? Why do we believe that that is the move to make and the bet that we want to make? You can start to view the world in that way. That's the art and science.
Yeah. And like you said, it's a really unique position. And I think it takes a unique personality type to excel in it, because a lot of times it's hard for people to think outside of the box a little bit. So like you just mentioned, even in revenue operations, right? We talk about the funnel or the user journey, right? And we talk about things like MQL to SQL to SQO, and it's, it's a deal moving through our pipeline or an opportunity moving through our pipeline, or we've got contacts or leads or companies. But those contacts, right? That MQL, that's a person that goes to your website and fills out a form. We've all done that. And then that's how that data manifests itself in your tools and systems that you look at. To take it one step further, you mentioned the finance piece of you close deals. Well, how do those show up on your financial statements? Some of the metrics you mentioned, like LTV versus CAC, right? Incorporate things like revenue per customer, churn rates to get to customer lifetime. There's a lot of different things that go into that. And those are data points pulled from your financial statements. You need to be able to put yourself in the shoes of like the user, your customer, going to a screen on their computer and filling out a form. How can we make this the most seamless experience possible? To then going to the end of the spectrum and being like, how does all that stuff manifest itself into revenue and marketing expense and sales expense on the financial statements for me to be able to split all that by segment and by channel? That's a lot. And a lot of people just aren't equipped to be able to do all those things well. And even if you told someone that that was going to be their job, a normal person would be like, hell no, that's a lot. I want to go and maybe stay in my lane over here, right? And just do a very specific thing. But anyone in RevOps, they're like, no, sign me up for that. I'm naturally curious. I want to solve problems. I want to learn new things. And I think for anyone trying to do well and climb the career ladder, if you will, in RevOps, keeping that natural curiosity sharp and always trying to get to the best answer to drive the best outcome, it'll serve you very, very well.
Yeah.
And all right, now for my non-RevOps related question. So we are holding RevOpsAF, which is our annual conference. And actually this next year, we're going to be holding our US event in May in New Orleans. And we're actually going to be doing a EMEA event over in Berlin in June. So for our New Orleans event, we're going to have about 300 to 350 people there. It'll be a lot of fun. We'll have sessions, offsite experiences, everything. But I want you to picture that you are the opening keynote speaker at RevOpsAF in New Orleans. You've got 350 people in the audience, and we call your name. Everyone's cheering, really excited to have you come on stage and do your talk. So you're entering stage left. What would be your walk-up song or music that you would play as you came on stage at RevOpsAF?
That is a great question.
And I've heard so many different answers. Someone I asked the other day told me The Sound of Music. People have brought up hip hop songs. We've got classic rock like AC/DC. I have the Tiger, right? There's no wrong answers, and they have truly been all over the place. So the sky is truly the limit, Henry.
I mean, the cheesy, probably very obvious and frequently answered answer to that would be smooth operator. Feels like a fun one.
I've actually only heard that once before, so it's not as common.
Okay. I love a pun, so I feel that's not remotely accountable to this hypothetical question. I guess that would be.
Yeah. Well, that's a good choice. A good song as well. Well, I'll leave us on that. Henry, thank you very much for dropping some knowledge on us today on all things kind of KPIs, goal setting, career growth. It was a lot of fun. I really appreciate it. So thank you for being here, my friend.
Thanks so much for tuning in to today's episode, everybody.
For more great content like this, join our community at RevOpsCoop.com and check out the links provided in the show notes.